all written guidance is intended to move people from knowledge-based performance mode, where the error rate is 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, to rule-based performance mode, where the error rate is 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. So if they follow that, that's your goal as a writer. And writers need to understand that, because if I create a rule and I'm in knowledge-based performance mode, in other words, I don't know what I don't know, then the knowledge-based error rate is what carries to the field, not the rule-based error rate. In other words, the error rate in the field, based on the way I wrote it from knowledge-based performance mode, is between 10 and 50%, not 1%. So the better the procedure, the higher the probability people will use it. And that's kind of debunking a bit of a myth. People don't use procedures. Well, they do. They do until they don't think it works, or they don't like it, or it doesn't work, or it becomes unusable. If you don't believe it, go buy some furniture at Ikea and take it home and try to put it together and see how fast you set the instructions aside. Or maybe you put together Barbie's Playhouse. It only has 1,000 pieces and 2 pictures. So we have to be more effective in our high-risk industries.
Hello and welcome everyone to our July continuing education event. My name is Jessica Morgan and I work with the Lucas Organizational Performance Team. We are joined by a special guest today, Rob Fisher with Fisher Improvement Technologies. Rob has been a friend both of Lucas and our very own Joe Esty for a long time. We're very honored to have him here. It's a remarkable community that we're involved in, with this belief that getting the right information to our community, our clients, to the business world in general is important. So he will be presenting today the keys to improving work methods and written instruction. Before we begin, I want to go over the On24 platform with you. Many of the boxes that you see in front of you can be minimized and moved around, so please feel free to explore the various applications and make the console look exactly how you need it to. Don't forget to download today's slides in the resource bin, and be sure to check the bottom menu. You have the opportunity to refer this webinar to a colleague or friend, or share it out on your social network. Today's slides are jam-packed full of information, so I do recommend that you maximize that menu or that window for you as well. Without a further ado, I'm excited to introduce Rob Fisher. There is a question and answer box, so throughout the presentation, feel free to submit your questions, and I'm happy to interrupt Rob and ask the question right away, or I'll hold it to the end. So thanks again for joining us, and here's Rob.
All right, thanks, Jessica. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Again, my name's Rob Fisher. I own a company called Fisher Improvement Technologies. We spent the last 30 years helping organizations and individuals understand why people make mistakes, especially mistakes that could prove to be catastrophic. And there's really only 3 things you can do with mistakes or human error. You can reduce their probability, you can prevent some of them, or you can mitigate their consequences. And you have to understand and know how to do that. Just a little bit of our background. I got started in the Navy, was a nuclear chemist, special operations, special forces submarines for about 10 years, then went into nuclear power. And I was at a plant that got in trouble for human performance before anybody knew what that was. So now it's gone through human performance, human and organizational performance, advanced error. There's all kinds of names for it. But we've had about 350,000 students globally in the last 15 to 20 years. And so one of the things that Joe and I have had conversations about in the past is how do you make sure that when we do write things down that they're good? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. To get started, I really wrote my first set of procedures on an IBM Selectric. And ever since that time, when I was using carbon paper, I guess I'm dating myself now, when I was using a typewriter and carbon paper, ever since that time, I've been trying to improve how those get put out. I was an operator, worked my way up through the operations ranks. So it was always to me about how is this usable? How can the individual in the field use what we're trying to give them? in the best way possible to reduce the probability they make a mistake or reduce the probability that they violate that procedure. And we're going to talk about both of those. So nowadays, it's an exciting time because the reality is the need hasn't changed, just the delivery. So you wouldn't have to tell someone anything different that I typed into an IBM Selectric than you would put on their iPad, or you would put on their visual, or you would put on their phone. And so as we think about that, we're getting better and better at how to communicate that, especially through written guidance. So in order to do that, I want to kind of establish, or for some of you reestablish, some of the science-based definitions that you need to know to make written guidance effective. Because in the end, what we're trying to do is make it so that it works. And when it works, you don't have bad things happen. It's the most efficient it can be. It's the most effective it can be. So in order to do that, we want to talk about some of the hot concepts and models that we use in written guidance. In order to do that, I want to talk about the top 5 error traps that go into procedures and process. So let's spend a little time on those. A little time on deviation potential and drift, because if you flip deviation potential, the probability somebody may deviate from a rule, standard, or expectation, you flip it upside down, what you get is compliance assurance. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then some critical attributes for written guidance. And again, please ask your questions along the way. I don't know whether you can raise hands in here, but you can certainly type into the chat box. There's no question off limits. There is a lot of information on the slides. Sometimes I even cover all of it, but you'll get copies of this after the fact. So you've probably all heard somebody in an organization say, "Oh, we've got good process. If we just get people to follow them, we'd be okay." Well, that's one of the phrases that when I hear a leader say that, it really makes my hair stand up on the back of my neck. Because if that was true, you wouldn't have nearly the incident rates that you have. So that's assuming that based on your opinion, the processes are good. And it's the people that are following them's fault that bad things are happening. So we started really looking at this 15 or 20 years ago and started discovering that there were some key elements to this challenge that people weren't paying a lot of attention to. And the first one is that these procedures or work instructions, they're the primary touch point between the people in the system. We don't do much out there in high-risk industry without some kind of written guidance. So that then becomes the conduit for what we want people to do and what they do. But isn't it interesting that there's no or very few experts available on why people make the kind of mistakes they do related to procedures? Years ago, the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations didn't even touch the procedure side in the human performance attributes. So the procedure quality element, which we'll talk about how we get there throughout the day today, is important, but there's just not a lot of people out there that have focused on that. And therefore, writers don't really know when they write a trap in. Maybe it's an engineer that went to school and got great grades in technical writing. But technical writing and effective procedure writing are not the same thing. So if the writers don't understand what drives mistakes in the field, they're going to keep writing them in because it's technically accurate. And then reviewers and approvers don't know what to look for. So if I don't have a list of the things that they should be looking for that actually drive field errors or mistakes or violations, it's going to go right through the reviewer because they're going to review, again, the technical accuracy. And then the last one is that users don't understand how they're impacted by these procedure error traps. We haven't really taught the users what those look like. So consistency of outcome requires consistency of method. For every variability you allow in method, you're allowing a variability of outcome. So I know there's a lot out there today on people being confused about how much you should write down, and people should be able to do what they want to do, and people will be as safe as they need to be. But that's not what we've found over the years. We've found over the years that there are certain things that have been written in blood, and those things need to be communicated in a way that we get people to do it. So let's start very quickly on the human and organizational performance side with the task-based system. The reason I show the task-based system is it's an interdependent system where the things on the outside, or what we're going to call systemic drivers, people, programs, processes, work environment, organization, equipment, they all surround an individual on any task, at home, work, at play, quality, safety, effectiveness, efficiency, productivity. This system doesn't know. So as someone's doing a task, they're surrounded by these elements. And you have two different types of drivers. You've got individual drivers, and those are the things that impact basically just me. Maybe I'm fatigued because I have a colicky baby at home, or maybe the grandkids spent the night last night, or as Jessica and I were talking about, maybe we have COVID puppies that are driving us nuts, and that's on our mind. Well, the person standing right next to us, it's not on their mind. Fatigue, that would be an individual driver. But we also have what we call systemic drivers. And systemic drivers are those things that make people do what they do. In other words, as the things on the outside of this task-based system change, the individual in the middle has to respond or react to those changes. We will tend to react to those changes in four very specific personality tendencies. You know, you've probably heard of doers, thinkers, socializers, and relators. We tend to see risk coming from these places differently. A socializer will see people risk before they'll see equipment risk. A thinker will tend to see process risk before they'll see people risk. So we have to teach ourselves to look for all the different elements. But why that's important to a writer is we can predict where that risk will come from all of the different systemic drivers. But we've got to know to do that, and we've got to look for it. But let's look more specifically about the way these impact instructions. Well, obviously, if you've got a program, then that program or policy needs to be written in a way that you get people to follow it. I mean, most of you are probably in the US and Canada. I know some of you are from England. Hi, Teresa. And but you can just tell by some of the policies that have come out through COVID that we're not paying a lot of attention as to whether people will follow them or whether they're followable or whether people trust them or not. But a writer has to do that if they want that to happen. The next one is the processes. That's the technical attributes of the task. Does it have more than 7 steps? Are there critical steps associated with it? How often is this task performed by the average user? Those are some considerations. But then watch this. The 3 of the other 4 elements also need to be considered and managed by the writer. How do we describe the operation of the equipment and the limitations of that equipment? How do we describe the organizational requirements associated with this task? How do we identify risk associated with the work environment for this person on this task at this time? So I say that, writers need to do this, but think about this if you were trying to teach your 14-year-old how to mow the yard. I mean, the reality is if you cover all of these elements, you've got a better chance that 14-year-old, that it's the first time they mow the yard, will have less risk than if you just told them, well, you've been watching me mow for 14 years, it's your turn. Now, you may or may not write that down, but you could. So when you start thinking this way, it makes writing it down a lot easier. Next thing from a human organizational performance perspective I want to cover are just some basic understandings. The first one comes from Deming, and that is about 90% of our problems are systemically driven. In other words, they're caused by something other than just the individual. You can look at the individual all you want, but you have to move back from the individual and see what those systemic drivers are doing. The second element is that as humans, we are very predictable. We hate that. We don't like that we're predictable. But we're very predictable physiologically. The way our bodies work are very predictable. We have the exact same physiological responses when we get tired, when we get stressed, when we get confused, we scratch our heads, we scratch our chins. You know, our bodies are wired certain ways, and about 95% of us, and what many of you have heard me say before, the other 5% don't work for you. Don't worry about them. So in other words, we're predictable, or stoplights wouldn't work. And trust me, I've been to Cairo where they turned them off. So we put about 15 million people and no stoplights in. that becomes a predictable chaos as well. The next one comes from Sidney Dekker. If you haven't read any of Sidney's work, I really encourage you to read The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. Sidney says very early in that book, says, if you believe that most people come to work to do a good job each day, then you must also believe that people do what they do at the time they do it for reasons that make sense to them at that time. And what we've added to that is what makes things make sense to people are other people, programs, processes, work environment, organization, equipment, and how we tend to react to those systemic drivers. So now you can start as a developer or a reviewer or approver of written guidance. You can start to put those task-based system elements together, but it is not common sense. Common sense is your belief that I should believe the way you believe on whatever we're talking about. It doesn't really exist, but leaders try to use that all the time. That's why they say we've got good processes. We can just get people to follow and we'd be okay. Not really, because you can have people attempting to follow processes, and those processes lead them down the wrong road. So stop trying to use and stop letting your leaders use the common sense defense, because there's no such thing. Here in the States, we have two news stations, Fox and MSNBC. They sit right next to each other on the TV. If there was such thing as common sense, that couldn't happen, because they both think they've got common sense. I'm not saying which one's right and which one's wrong, but they both think they're spewing common sense. So take the common sense argument out of it. When times get rough, and they will, back up to these basic understandings, especially when you're trying to describe to somebody why you want written guidance to do a certain thing. The next thing we have to understand as people who touch written guidance are the definitions of the things we are trying to help prevent. The first one is the definition of an error. Now, an error is an action or an action that unintentionally does one of three things. It results in an undesirable or unwanted condition, it leads a task or system outside of limits, or it deviates from a set of rules. But those are all unintentionally. The action is intentional. You take your foot off the brake and you put it on the gas. It's the result that is unintentional. I didn't know the light wasn't green yet. So we have to learn to separate errors from events. And very often, when we get the direction to change a procedure, they're directing us to stop an event, but we don't really know what drove it yet. So the next two pieces are the difference between a deviation, which is something you see. Someone isn't wearing their safety glasses. Someone isn't wearing their hard hat. Someone is wearing the wrong fall protection. And a violation, which is when that is done with conscious intent to be outside the rule, standard, or expectation. So a violation and an error are different things. We are trying through written guidance to prevent or reduce the probability of both of those, but we have to understand what they are, because you have two different types of errors: active errors and latent errors. Sharp end of the stick, turn wrong switch, wrong thing happens. Open wrong valve, stuff goes to wrong place. Run stop sign, get hit by truck. Active error, almost immediate cause and effect. But then you also have latent errors that create latent conditions that lay there dormant, waiting on something else to happen. And that thing that happens is usually some kind of active error. When we touch written guidance, we are creating or reducing the probability of latent errors. But the challenge is that if we don't use the definitions and we don't know what we're talking about, then people aren't going to believe we're trying to help them prevent those things. Even when you start showing them that the guidance contains error traps, or that they need tools to reduce their probability, if you can't really show that you understand what you're trying to help prevent or mitigate, then they're not going to believe you. So the definitions that really apply to written guidance are a deviation. That's a condition, something you see. An error, that's when they deviate, but it's unintentional. They may not even know they're outside the rule, standard, or expectation. Or a violation where there's conscious intent to violate. So those three things fall under the category of something you see, a condition, an action or inaction that results in an undesirable condition, but it's unintentional, and then a conscious decision that is intentional. So as developers of guidance, we have to keep these in mind because we're trying to really prevent all of them, or we're trying to reduce their probability. But we have to characterize the way we write things in order to do that. We've got to have our brain around what happened. If I could tell a quick story, we're walking through an oil field and we see a whole bunch of workers, 10 of them, on a platform that was 10 feet off the ground, and they were all in 15-foot lanyards. Well, the procedure clearly said always wear the appropriate fall protection. So the vice president that was with me yelled at him and said, "You're violating the rule for fall protection." Then the supervisor came down and said, "What are you talking about?" So we come down to 10 feet and do this task once every 18 months, and we wear the fall protection we wear every day. And so they started talking about that. And the workers didn't even realize, they weren't even thinking, they saw risk differently. They normally work at 50 feet, which they see as high risk. They today came down to 10 feet, which they saw as low risk. So they weren't even, they wear these harnesses every day. They weren't even thinking about the protection, and there was nothing that guided them that they were now more at risk at 10 feet in a 15-foot lanyard than they were at 50 feet in a 15-foot lanyard. And oh, by the way, the closest 6-foot lanyard was 22 miles away. They only had one of them, and they never used those because you need to be in a 15-foot lanyard to reach all the equipment. So you start to see that these are predictable systemic drivers, but we have to understand the way bad things happen to prevent them, to mitigate them. So if you think about bad outcomes, about 85% of them have to do with some kind of human error or some kind of challenge that isn't outside the organization's control. And about 90% of those are errors, most of those active. But then we've also got those other two. A task goes outside of its limits and then we bring it back in. Or we deviate from a rule, standard, or expectation. The deviation is unintentional, but the action is intentional. And then only about 10% are related to violations. Now you say, well, where did this come from? Well, go back to dimming. I mean, for crying out loud, you use dimming everywhere else in your organization. How do we know how much to sample? Use statistical process controls. That comes from dimming. I mean, he's got 14 principles of quality, and one of them says in any industrial process, if you've got a problem, there's a 90% certainty that problem is systemic in nature, not individual in nature. Fix the system, you fix it for good. Fix the individual, you only fix it for now. So if you start to really think about those things, these can be systemically driven. Your written guidance can back someone into a corner, and the only way out is for somebody to violate a different one of your rules. If you ask that question to your workforce, everybody has an answer for it. When do we back you into a corner that makes you deviate or violate a different one of our rules? Over here on the right, these are our non-systemic drivers. These are isolated. Down here at the bottom, you'll notice we have isolated violations. Now, in many organizations, the managers think everything is an isolated violation. But what they are is 1/10 of the violations, which are 1/10 of the bad outcomes that the organization has some influence over. So I don't want you to just believe this guy from North Carolina, push your I believe button, say, okie dokie, that sounds good. All of this comes from information and data that we've collected over the years, whether it's dimming or PII or reason. These are all research backed. So when you talk to your leaders about them, don't make them think about just believing you. Make them understand that they can't fall back on those old things, because about 90% of the deviations are errors. Less than 10% of them are violations. About 90% of violations are systemically driven. In other words, the author of written guidance has a large influence on the systemic drivers that comprise the majority of these charts. So just very quickly, I want to cover the performance modes, because in the end, and shameless plug, I've got a book that's coming out on the mental models that people use here pretty soon. And they're really miscommunicated quite a bit. So skill-based performance mode is things we do out of habit, not thinking, using low or no conscious thought. You have to have done this thing over 50 times in a short period of time, and it's got to be less than 7 steps long in order to be in skill-based performance mode. This isn't skill of the craft. It's skill-based performance mode. In other words, we don't have to think about it. The second one is rule-based. There's a rule, and I know there's a rule. I don't have to know the rule. I just have to know it exists so I can do something about it. Now, the standard failure rate in rule-based performance mode is about 1%. We're going to blow it about 1% of the time in rule-based performance mode. That's if we're doing things from memory and it's less than 7 steps long. So if you give somebody something written down and it's right and they follow it, you can have error rates that are even better than the skill-based error. But the one we've got to worry about is knowledge-based performance mode. And this is really based on gaps in your knowledge. It's when you don't know what you don't know. The thing about knowledge-based performance mode is you can't think your way out. Your brain knows I've got this gap, but the error rate is between 10 and 50%. So it's important that writers understand this, because all written guidance is intended to move people from knowledge-based performance mode, where the error rate is 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, to rule-based performance mode, where the error rate is 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. So if they follow that, that's your goal as a writer. And writers need to understand that, because if I create a rule and I'm in knowledge-based performance mode, in other words, I don't know what I don't know, then the knowledge-based error rate is what carries to the field, not the rule-based error rate. In other words, the error rate in the field, based on the way I wrote it from knowledge-based performance mode, is between 10 and 50%, not 1%. So the better the procedure, the higher the probability people will use it. And that's kind of debunking a bit of a myth. People don't use procedures. Well, they do. They do until they don't think it works, or they don't like it, or it doesn't work, or it becomes unusable. If you don't believe it, go buy some furniture at Ikea and take it home and try to put it together and see how fast you set the instructions aside. Or maybe you put together Barbie's playhouse. It only has 1,000 pieces and 2 pictures. So we have to be more effective in our high-risk industries, because if it's right and people use it, you get consistency of method, which gives you consistency of outcome. But most of the things we say about procedures, they're myths. They're not facts. Well, the procedure's too long. Why would they carry around 30 pages? I don't know. Give them something that is only this task and allow them to use it. We don't have to carry around volumes of books anymore. We have an electronic society. Well, if I reduce the font, then it'll be less pages and it'll be more effective. Well, I'm freaking blind in one eye. Don't reduce the font on me, because I won't be able to read anything. So as you get an older generation, I'm probably not politically supposed to say that, but if you've got some people in the field that are older and you reduce the font, what you do is decrease the legibility of that written guidance. And there's about 25 known error traps. Your writers should know what those are, but most organizations don't teach what they are, so the writers don't know it. And then when it comes down to somebody not using a procedure right, they just call it procedure not followed. So let's just look very quickly at the top 10 error traps. Stress, multitasking, or high workload, time pressure, those really all feel the same to us. I don't have to remember them. They all feel like frustration. So when I get that feeling, I know those are the triggers that tell me that trap exists. The next 4 are interesting: poor communications, vague or poor written guidance, overconfidence, infrequent or first-time tasks. They either put us in or keep us in knowledge-based performance mode. In other words, if somebody poorly communicates, then I may not know what I don't know about that. If I'm overconfident, it shrouds my ability to see when I move into knowledge-based performance mode. And the last 3, they kind of interact with all the other traps. A distraction tries to make you multitask. That's what it does to your brain. First working day back means that you're trying to do a high workload, or you may not be focused on the task yet. End of shift or working shift, you get under time pressure or some high workload. So they start to interact with the other ones. So it's important that we understand the triggers for these traps. Now, I'm not here today to discuss those, except those that are related to vague or poor written guidance. Because remember, these traps either put you in or keep you in knowledge-based performance mode, where the error rate is 10 to 50%. So just in this one error trap, there's 25 known error traps for procedures. So think about it this way. I'm going to give you one of them. When you see the terms if applicable, when applicable, if needed or when needed, if appropriate or as appropriate, if desired or if required, when you see those terms in a procedure, then that puts people in knowledge-based performance mode, where the error rate is 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. And I'll cover that a little bit more later. But how many of these traps do you think the people that touch written guidance know? Know to the point that they can eliminate them. And once you know them, it's kind of like being in knowledge-based performance mode. Now that I know if I scratch my head or I scratch my chin, my error rate's as high as 50%, I can't unsee that. Once I learn what the error traps are, I can't unsee it, because it tends to drive what we call deviations. Now, I don't know whether it's going to be a violation or an error, but deviation potential says that the probability of either one of the types of deviations, conscious or unconscious, will increase or decrease based on the difficulty. As difficulty, either mental difficulty or physical difficulty, goes up, the probability of deviation goes up. As perceived risk goes up, the probability of deviation goes down. So one of your jobs as a writer is to make the perceived risk match the real risk. And in order to do that, we have to look at the systemic drivers. And the last one is that observation tends to drive deviation. Now, that's been around for a long time. But we've seen that sometimes we drift. And I realize that this is a bit of an eye chart, but you've probably seen drift described as, we've got a rule, it's described, and over time, sometimes it could be years, we drift away from that. Then all of a sudden we have an incident. And after that incident, we come shining a bright light of root cause on it. Can I get an amen? And all of a sudden, people start looking at it, and the managers say, you know what? You can't be that far away from that rule without knowing it, therefore it must be a violation. And they hang their hat on that assumption. So a couple of years ago, a gentleman called Todd Conklin, if you haven't read Todd Conklin's books on human performance, pre-accident investigation, or the 5 elements of human performance, then I encourage you to do that. We were sitting over in Norway, and we were actually at this table, and we started talking about how drift really happens. And we said, you know, it really happens at the task level, or at the step level of the task. It's not this continual drift over time until it becomes the normalization of deviance. No, it's adaptability of the worker on this task at this time for what they see on this step. Well, that kind of became known in the industry later on as them being the masters of the blue line. Now, if that's worker adaptability, that can be predicted if you go to the workers to have them tell you how that's going to happen on this type of task. But isn't it interesting that when we're below the line and somebody out there believes we've reduced the margin of safety, that we call that a violation, but when we're above the line, we call it innovation or continuous improvement. They're both still deviations. So it's not about the deviation. We could probably draw a line on top of this and a line on the bottom of this, and if you stay between those lines, you're good to go. But the workers have to help us do that. They have to help us build in adaptability. I know you can't write everything down, but you can write down the things that make adaptability work. The last thing I want to talk about on deviation potential is that The observation piece is really far less impact than was originally thought. And that's because of the Hawthorne effect. We'll alter our behaviors based on our environment. If Jessica comes out to watch me, I'm going to alter my behaviors. So I don't really get the drift. I may see her deviate from a rule. Heck, if she deviates from a rule right in front of me, chances are, unless she went like this before she did it, it's probably not a violation. She's doing it right in front of me. There's no shame. That's probably not a violation. So I need to take that into account. But remember, I talked about compliance assurance. All I got to do is flip this equation upside down and manage those driving elements. So if you take risk perception and you deal with it and you make it high, you let people go out and make sure they continuously reinforce the standards, and you reduce difficulty, what you've done is increase the probability of overall compliance. So I like to do this about halfway through. If everybody would just take a very quick stretch, and if you have a question, type it into the block. We sit in front of our computers all day long, some of us, and
I have to laugh as you were talking about the top 10 error traps. Assembling that Barbie house usually happens about midnight on Christmas Eve. And as I was reading through some of those, I'm going, man, you hit all 10 of those error traps on that Christmas Eve Barbie house assembly.
Yeah, well, it wasn't long after the top 10 error traps were developed that I had to put a Barbie funhouse together for my daughter for Christmas, and that was exactly what I thought. Good perception.
Yeah, it's late. I'm tired. I've never done this before. I've been off work for 4 days. That was great.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the critical attributes for effective written guidance. And again, some of these will be a little bit of an eye chart, but there's 5 things that you want to provide to the worker related to written guidance. It needs to be available, workable, intelligible, correct, and consistently reinforced. Now, where these come from is actually something called deviation analysis. How do I analyze what drives deviations? So those attributes become the things that you can write in or that you can take into account as a writer that will help people follow the procedure. If any of those are no, it's not available, workable, intelligible, correct, or consistently reinforced, it makes it more prone to errors, deviations, and violations. If all of them are yes, people are less prone to deviations or violations. So let's look at each one of those. The first one is availability. How easy is it for people to get? One of the things I've noticed as we've become more electronic, I said, we can't have that procedure out there. Can't have that old raggedy thing out in your toolbox anymore. You have to have the latest approved revision of the last date available. And in order to get that, you've got to print it out daily. And then you send somebody out 30 miles from the office. So you have to make sure that things are available. I was working with a client not long ago that had this rule on the newest approved revision, and yet none of the maintenance people had access to the procedure files because none of them had emails. You can daisy chain that all the way down. So they have to be available. The next one is they need to be workable. In other words, they have to be usable. They don't contain the top 5 error traps. You don't write the rest of the 25 down. So you can equate workability and usability by looking at whether it contains the traps, field decisions, difficulty, vague or misleading information, conflicting attitudes and formats, or multiple or embedded actions. So field decisions, that's where these if applicable, when applicable, if needed, when needed, if appropriate, as appropriate, if desired, or if required. You can tell I've said that a couple of times. But it requires people to make a decision, and decisions are made in knowledge-based performance mode, or the rule would be written. So field decisions have a field error rate 11 times higher than a well-written step. So now let's see if we think that's true. The difference between rule-based performance mode, 1 in 100, and knowledge-based performance mode, 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, does a factor of 11 fall into that? So now I will tell you, it is hugely powerful to your people when the predicted science matches the data. And you can tell them what that is. And field decisions is one of the places you can do that. You have to think about the number of aspects that people are trying to consider. Maybe you use some kind of decision aid, and that helps them. Maybe you make the information more ready to them. Now more than ever, I was working with somebody last week that had all of this information, and it was tucked in the back of an addendum. But they had an electronic procedure. I said, why don't you just put a link right there that brings that information up in the native procedure? And it was face clap. And the reason is because we now have the ability to do things like that. We have to take into account the availability of that information and the decision makers' personality tendencies that we talked a little bit about before. Is it reasonable to believe that different people with different personalities make decisions differently? Some faster than others, some slower. Some require more information, some require less. I'm not saying you need to write 4 different procedures. You don't have to do that. If you write the traps out, then you don't have to worry about the personality of the person. The second trap is difficulty, and there's 2 different types, mental and physical. Mental difficulty. You told me this once, a long time ago, and now I've got to remember it. Or you told me this earlier. Maybe it's in a pre-job briefing, or maybe it's in a meeting. Maybe you threw it in the precautions and limitations. Always follow all requirements on fall protection. So as difficulty goes up, deviations go up. So if we don't write difficulty in, whether it's a difficult task or something that's hard, it's too far, there's too many, there's too few, it's too hard. If we don't write those in that way, we reduce that probability. Maybe it's unnecessary or unreasonable. People don't think they need to do it. Maybe they're able to use NA. And what you may not know is if you cull through all of the information, and some of you may or may not remember where you were when the Challenger exploded. Some of you weren't born yet. But when the Challenger exploded and they pulled it back, the temperature for that day was NA. You may not know that for Columbia, doing the check of the foam was NA'd. And I will tell you, my very first fatality investigation was the Texas A&M bonfire collapse. Now, for those of you who aren't from the U.S., in 1999, during the building phase of the Texas A&M bonfire, and you can see how big it is, it collapsed and killed 12 kids and injured 75 more. That was my first fatality investigation. They were supposed to have put a wire rope around SAC 1, but that was NA'd. And the result was that bonfire fell and killed. Now, those people thought they could NA it. They had reason to believe they could. It was easy to shortcut. Sometimes we have to contact other organizations, or sometimes we get branched out. Trap number 3, vague terms. And you can see what the vague terms are, but also use of shall, should, may, would, could, not. When we use those terms, we think a shall means something, but it doesn't really mean what we think it means. We were just rewriting a lockout tagout procedure a couple of weeks ago that had 360 shalls in the procedure, and now it has none. It's written in active voice. Sometimes it can be misleading. It's missing critical information. It's missing critical steps. It's when the user has to make an assumption that lead them in the wrong direction. That's typically vague. Maybe it's conflicting. And what I mean by conflicting is, have you ever gone in the shower at a hotel and it turns a different direction than your shower at home, and you're trying to adjust it while you're getting your hair wet, and you turn it towards cold instead of hot because that's the way it goes at home? Maybe you've got a valve that's reverse acting. We had a valve that was reverse acting, mounted upside down in the deck plate. So we would stand over it for hours trying to figure out which direction was closed. And it routinely got tagged in the wrong wrong position. We have to tell people if there's conflicting information. But it can also be that we write in different formats. And that what that does, it shakes up our brain and it makes us wonder, gosh, I wonder what's different about that. Those inconsistent words or inconsistent expressions or even inconsistent formats. So something like font can make your brain distract and try to multitask. But double negative statements in procedures increase the error rate by 280%. So I like to tell people, don't use no double negatives. That was your humor for the day. The last trap is multiple actions and embedded actions. Anytime we put 3 or more actions in the same step, so no more than 2, it's multiple actions. Or we may embed the actions in a caution note or warning or a precaution or limitation. So a warning that contains a step or a precaution that contains a step, we don't want those to happen because our brains don't see the step in something that we don't think contains a step. The next one is intelligible. Now, if you live in a border state, or maybe sometimes you don't, if you have a lot of bilingual employees or contractors, we sometimes use technical terms that are harder for bilingual people to understand. We need to make it so that the people that are using it can understand the document. The next one is technical accuracy. I'm just going to come out and say it. Most of your procedures are probably technically accurate. The problem is they're not usable. And your subject matter experts, when somebody comes in and says, hey, this procedure doesn't work, the engineer argues with them and said, yes, it does. I wrote it myself. It works. And the reality is it doesn't work because it's not usable for the person. And the last one is consistently reinforced. Now, this is the one you have least control over as a writer. The people that review and approve procedures have the least control over it. But if you write it well, it's easy to consistently reinforce. If you write it sucky, it's horribly hard to consistently reinforce it. So I realize I talk fast. I realize I put a lot of information out. But what I want to make sure that we did and then open up for some questions is, did we establish some of those science-based definitions? And can you use those because they're important to effective written guidance? I know I described some of the human performance concepts and models, and I hope there's some questions on those. We introduced the top 5 error traps and what those look like. Described a little bit about deviation potential, the probability that people will deviate and drift. And I introduced some of the critical attributes of written guidance. So what I'd like to do is open it up to any questions that you have and maybe even have a dialogue, if that's possible, on some of those questions. And as I do that, I'm going to put up a link that goes to a free website called Fit Online that the QR code takes you to that website. And everything that I just talked about, there are 2 to 5 minute videos on all of those things. So I'll open it up for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions coming in regarding content. I guess that goes to show how efficient you are in explaining the material. I did have a question. You mentioned the book that you have coming out. Feel free. When is it coming out? Where can people find it? We'd love some more information on that.
Yeah, I'd love some more information on that too. I'm in the recording phase of the audio book right now. I'm hoping to have the 3, the audio book, the electronic book, the hardcover out in a few months. But it's called Understanding Mental Models is the title. And it goes through the performance modes, use of System 1 and System 2, and kind of how our brain works.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we'll leave the Q&A box open a little bit longer. I would like to encourage all of our attendees to not only visit Rob's website, but to check back to lucasopt.com. We are taking next month off with our continuing education. It's August and people are busy next month. We will be back in September. Joe SD Sr., back by popular demand, will be going over our change management model again. For those of you that missed it the first time, it's a great explanation of how to effectively implement and manage change in an organization. Rob, I know that you're keynoting an event on Monday. Do you want to share that information as well?
Yeah, the Procedure Professionals Association has been around for about 25 years, and it's an association of people who touch procedures, mostly procedure writers. And their conference is on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I believe. And I'm keynoting that, and then doing a session on how do you grade procedures. And you can go to ppaweb.org, ppaweb.org, and sign up for that. Or if you hit me up on LinkedIn, I think there's a link in one of my posts to sign up for that as well.
Wonderful. Well, I did not see any questions come in other than looking for more information on your book. I'm sure people will stay tuned and look for that as it comes. I would like to thank everyone for attending today. As I mentioned, Lucas likes to do these at least once a month as just a free to you webinar to get the right information out to the right people. Lucas is very active, as well as Rob, in the community of human and organizational learning, formerly HPRCT. So that's another site to check out for information to truly help you guys improve the organizations that you work in. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.